Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today's episode, before we take a Thanksgiving Day break, is with Misha Chellam. He is the co-founder of the Abundance Network. Misha has done really great work organizing the community of folks who are interested in the topic of abundance and where this broader building and supply side liberalism conversation moves from here. As a lot of folks will know, especially those who've written in, there's a lot of interest in abundance, not only at this podcast level, but at a everyday, where do we go here perspective. So not only should folks reach out to Abundance Network if they'd like to learn more, but they should also consider this is a space that is very new. There are all sorts of abundance related questions that haven't been answered yet. And what I think makes Misha such a great guest is that he's someone who recognizes not only that fact, but then responds to it with the idea that the answer then is to broaden the tent and bring smart, ambitious, and interested folks into it to actually work on addressing those broader questions and answers. So huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. And I will see you all after the Thanksgiving break. Misha Chellam, welcome to the Realignment.
Hey, Marshall. Good to see you.
Really pumped to chat. We've been talking not even off the record, just offline for the past few months. So I'm pumped to actually do an episode with you. So here's how I'm going to set this up. We're obviously going to go through the definitions of the abundance agenda, talk about the movement, but we're going to kind of do this episode with the presumption that a lot of folks have listened to Steve and my episodes where we sort of like academically bloviate about abundance to the most nichest of directions. But after those episodes, we'll say, hey, and reach out to us if you're interested in this topic, in this space, and want to organize and do things. And everyone just sort of says like, cool, we want to do something. What do we do? And it's like, share the podcast. And that's basically all I have to offer. So I was actually pumped to chat with someone who's a part of this abundance ecosystem we're building out, but who's actually very focused on actually providing a space, programs, networks, on the ground organizing. So how about you kind of like introduce, we'll do two questions to start with, which everyone hates, but I think will be pretty easy here. A, like, why are you attracted to the abundance agenda, the abundance movement? And then B, then what are you actually doing then at an organizational level of Abundance Network to do that?
Yeah. So why am I interested or attracted? I mean, it makes sense to my brain. Like it feels that the ideas, YIMBYism was sort of where I had an entry point because my co-founder was one of the co-founders of California YIMBY, which is one of the lead sort of organizations pushing for housing abundance. And I think, ideas of state capacity and lack of state capacity from Jen Polka and others, like they just resonate with my normie everyday citizen experience. So I think in many ways, I have gravitated to this space because it's answered questions that I had as a citizen, which is like, why doesn't stuff work better? So that's how I got here. The things that we're building or working on. Yeah. So I live in Alameda in the East Bay of California. And a lot of folks in our area come from the startup world, and a lot of the folks that I work in come from the startup world. I think, the startup world, like any community, has strengths and weaknesses. I think, one of the strengths is just it's a kind of builder culture and sort of a culture that is used to building new things. And so when I started a group back in 2018, which was basically a bunch of founders and VCs who were interested in learning about public policy and sort of learning about what was going wrong with, why society wasn't working better. We started thinking about it at the federal level and then sort of decided partisanship scrambles people's brains at the federal level. So let's just focus in California because there are no Republicans to blame anything on. And so the problems have to be more sort of complicated or nuanced, or something else is going on beyond partisanship. And so that kind of got us down the road of, these supply side constraints that exist in liberal states and cities, the state capacity issues that exist. So we started by building a donor network. And so there's a couple hundred families in that donor network. And we were giving money to folks like Scott Wiener or Buffy Wicks, supporting organizations like California YIMBY, and doing that at the state level. And then eventually we decided even the state level is sort of too big upon to to sort of really build power in. So we started building these municipal chapters. And so that's kind of our core program today, is these municipal chapters. And I don't want to sell out ahead of where we are. So we have like one sort of robust chapter that's in San Francisco. And then we've got little kind of chapterlings in Oakland and Santa Monica, and are now looking to sort of replicate the success we've had, or early success we've had in San Francisco, and sort of expand those city chapters around the country. So that's our core program. And before this, I said, Marshall, is it okay if I sell on your show? And you licensed me to sell. And so I think,
you do owe me $50,000 now. I didn't specify that. I'm like, there is a catch to do a sponsored episode.
But the idea, like the first thing I'd want to put out is, we believe that these city chapters or local chapters will be a way to make the abundance movement real. Like, there are many people sort of thinking about and talking about the abundance movement. I think that the ideas are really important, and I don't want to undercut the importance of ideas, but then I also think translating ideas into political power and action is also important. And I'm happy to go into more why we think that it makes sense to start locally, or why we're focused there. But that's one thing, is like, we want to set up these chapters in other cities around the country.
I will say, I hope y'all come to Texas soon, because when I do these abundance episodes, not just because I live in Austin and I'm at UT, so there's a lot of people who sort of think of this as a very Texas-based show, but from my perspective, I just tend to get most of my like organic, I'm interested, I'm smart, I'm in my 20s, I'm in my 30s, looking for community, looking to do things energy from Texas. So I hope you do that at a very literal level, not just talking my own book here. But then B, I also think Texas is a high priority for abundance, because sort of, I think the Texas and California examples are like two sides of the same, or different sides of the same coin, in that California is where you see a lot of the problems that abundance is going to really highlight and want to focus on, that the YIMBY people want to focus on, and that the state capacity people want to focus on. Texas is cool because Texas, in many ways, that run counter to the obvious narratives about cultural polarization and like how fractious 21st century politics are. Texas is a story of is a state that's just doing a lot of the things that abundance wants to do. So I think that there's a real priority there, because I also don't want, and I've also gotten this feedback from elected officials who have reached out, one of their worries about the California-centric focus on abundance and YIMBYism, et cetera, is that this becomes just too California and too San Francisco coded. So I'd love for you to talk about, and then there's really strong work that they're doing, especially if you're in like New York. But that's also like not what let me put it this way. If I was in Nebraska right now, I wouldn't say like, hey, I talked to these Californians and these New Yorkers. They've got some big ideas about bringing the problems that they've brought to our state. So can you talk about like the intersection of like the state, the local, and then the national narratives here?
Yeah, that's right. And I've never watched a video podcast of the alignment. I've listened to many episodes. And so for our audio only folks, I am like vigorously thumbs upping and nodding to when Marshall was just saying that. I agree that there's a real trap to having all this thinking baked in, coastal sort of places. And so that's why we're very, we started in our backyard because that was,
where you are,
convenient.
To be fair,
we are.
Because
exactly.
I want to be precise. I'm not critiquing what you've done up until now, because that actually makes sense. Like you start, and this is actually the thing, this is organic. There are people who are actually interested. You build the networks. Like that's how organizing actually works. So this isn't meant as criticism, but like it's still a dynamic that emerges as you start thinking about expansion.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think maybe, so one step back on sort of defining abundance, and I think it's important because it points to why we're sort of thinking about this local and building up from there. I listened to I'm going to get his name wrong, Auchincloss.
Jake Auchincloss.
Auchincloss, yeah. So I listened to that episode, and I think from a political point of view, it makes total sense to me to try to keep the framing of what this work is about very simple. It's about cost. It's about increasing supply so that in a classic economic supply demand curve, you decrease the cost of goods. I think that totally makes sense. And I think that for me is a part of abundance. But I also think, when you think about public safety or public education, these aren't cost issues per se. Like, we're not saying we want to spend less, maybe we want to spend less tax dollars on police and education, but that's not our primary concern. It's like we want to feel safe in our communities. We want to feel like our kids can get a good education through the public school system. And those are issues of sort of capacity of the state to deliver on things that we want it to deliver on. And so for me, like when I step back and I say, like, what is the abundance movement for? Like, what is the abundance movement? For me, it is a movement to build a 21st century government. And a 21st century government would, supply a good amount of, would create a affordable, high quality building blocks to a good life. And some of that it's going to be doing by structuring markets more effectively and efficiently, like the housing market. And some of it's going to be done, not by structuring the market for public safety, but just by making the institutions that are supposed to deliver public safety, deliver them more effectively. And so once you have that framing that that's what the abundance movement is about, then you start thinking, well, like, what are the institutions of government? And, San Francisco, and these numbers are high, both because San Francisco is a very wealthy place and because it's a city county, but combined city functions and county functions. But San Francisco is, $15 billion a year, 39,000 person organization. So that's a massive organization. Mm-hmm. And, to change manage an organization of that size, even if it was in the private sector and like a CEO could come in and fire, however many people they wanted from day one. They weren't worried about sort of unions, they weren't worried about politics. They weren't worried about civil service rules. Like, that would still be an incredibly complex task. And that's one city with less than 1 million people in it. Right. Mm-hmm. And so we just think that the work of sort of building 21st century government, reforming the way that, the agencies and departments carry out their work is just like very hard. And so, starting at the local level where you can get actual humans who care to show up and do things, which, we've been able to do, and make sense because it's, it is more. I don't think I think it's a misnomer that people say like people are more informed. Like, everyone knows sort of intuitively that people are more informed about national politics than they are about local politics. Like, many people could name, presidential candidates or potentially even
their senator,
and nobody has any clue who their city council member is. So on the one hand, I think people are less informed about local government. On the other hand, it feels much more like tractable and present in their lives. And so I think that's the thing that we want to build off of. But anyway, so doing this work locally, I think starting locally can really get to the underlying functions of these agencies and departments. The sort of the size of the market is much smaller in terms of like just sort of the dollars and players in local politics is reasonably small compared to like at the national level. And so our theory is you sort of build from the ground up. You identify, the donors, the advocates, the elected officials, et cetera, who identify with this way of thinking. Those people both rise in their careers and also, I believe that will find problems and are starting to find problems that they're local problems, but they actually connect to state policy and federal policy that makes it hard to solve the local problem because I think these things are all entangled with each other. So anyways, that was a long-winded way of saying that's why we're thinking about local chapters.
No, totally. I think it's really, really critical. I want to just highlight something you gave in one of your answers where you were pointing out that, Abundance's mission is 21st century government. And I like the idea of like you're merging the state capacity. Can government do the things it's supposed to do with the questions of abundance? And then, of course, like NIMBYism, which people often separate these out into different movements. And actually that makes sense at an organizational level. So like there should just be like a think tank who works on state capacity issues. Like you can't actually do all three with maybe at an expertise level. But I think these are deeply intertwined, need to be synced together because like, once again, let's say we're looking at, and this is why it's actually pretty frustrating that like right now there's this It's definitely on Twitter, but it really matters. There's this big fight between people who are very publicly abundance agenda YIMBY, and then other folks who are sort of in like the post neoliberal movement, very much like undergirding like the Biden like the Chips Act and the Inflation Reduction Act and everything. And there's this big fight because like there's these big grand like meta narratives that we're focused on versus the actual what are we proposing. And I think what we need to do is like focus on the actual what thing that we're actually proposing. So let's say you're a post neoliberal who believes strongly that like one of their big ideas, and I think post neoliberals are way too academic. So it's like it's so much easier to explain abundance than it is to explain post neoliberalism. But basically, the post neoliberal idea here was the Inflation Reduction Act. Like, hey, like government, by dint of how much money it could put into different programs, different ideas, can shape markets and then create new incentives. So it's not that we need to create the 20th century government run electricity company that's doing what the Tennessee Valley Authority. It's just saying like, hey, government via its buying power can create a whole new market that could really change the way we incentivize electrification and the transformation to a clean economy. I think that's totally true. The problem, and we see this through the Biden administration, whether or not it cost them the election or not, is that there's a difference between saying, hey, government's going to market shape, government's going to invest, we're going to do the CHIPS Act, we're going to do the IRA, and our actual ability to build things. And I think the key story that I want to hear more from post neoliberals on was just like when Pete Buttigieg, as transportation secretary, is on ABC this week, and they're like, "Hey, like, why is it that with $4 billion you only built 7 or 8 charging stations?" The key phrase here is it was literally like 7 or 8, which means that like literally like it, as a former fact checker at PBS, that literally means like it can't actually legally be like determined whether there were 7 or 8 from a fact checking perspective. That's where YIMBY comes in. Right? Can we actually build things we don't build? Abundance comes in through because it's from the perspective of like, hey, like we should be thinking about like, do we have more electricity? If I want to get an electric car but drive like back to Oregon where I grew up, like, can I actually do that? Like that's the thing you have to really think about. And then finally, like the state capacity question, the question of like, can the American state actually fulfill this market shaping mission? Because like the goal isn't to, once again, this something abundance is better. Our goal isn't to transition from the neoliberal era. It's to like actually improve people's lives and have a better political and economic situation. And I just think abundance is like just really, really, really well centered in on that. So the point of like this long running rant is just that if we just look at like things the post neoliberal Biden National Economic Council people were trying to do, and you look at the things that at a tactical level post neoliberal, the things at a tactical level the abundance agenda folks like us are focused on, they're very, 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 very compatible, and they're actually like quite needed. Like I don't think there's a single abundance person who said like, oh yeah, I think the Inflation Reduction Act was a bad idea, or I think the CHIPS Act was a bad idea. I think we're just more focused on the planks that like act within there. So I'd love to hear just like your take on, and last but not least, like I know I sort of diminished this conversation by saying like, oh, this is all happening on Twitter, but this conversation matters because like at this moment, and it's to the weakness of both movements, these are some very elite conversations, right? These are conversations that like funders are having right now. These are happening in Hill offices. These are happening within like campaign staffs who are already getting ready for 2028. These elite level discourses like really, really matter. Because if you look at the Democratic Socialists, like eventually they got bodies of people who were super down for Bernie, but what really mattered 2014, 2015, when they won over the op-ed pages and they got Vox basically like agreeing to admitting to their frame. So that elite conversation matters more than you think it would, but just would love to hear your general thoughts on this broad topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny because within our team, I'm more I'm more a bridge to the ideas conversations and am, slightly more plugged into them. And I think, some folks on our team, I think are so in the weeds of, or I don't mean in the weeds, but like they're so focused on sort of local power building that these conversations that we're having
have nothing to do with.
Yeah. And so, but I believe, like you believe, that, I think ideas are really important. I think is sort of on the ground action are really important. They're both important. I think on the big idea side, yeah, that's right. I don't see, a ton incompatible with sort of abundance and other, ideas. The post neoliberal thing to me is more like a provocation that the some old system didn't work and it's not yet clearly articulating what a new system is. I think kind of regardless of what that new system is, it's like you need to be able to enact it or carry it out. And I think that's this idea of just having, performant kind of agencies and departments. I mean, as Jen Paulko would say, it's like you can write words, they don't automatically self-execute. There's actually just like a ton of humans. And again, going back to the San Francisco example, it's like there are 39,000 humans carrying out the instructions that a set of, elected leaders put into the system. And they're, whether that's the right number of people, maybe that's too many people, maybe we would be more effective with fewer folks. Maybe we should be revisiting what the instructions we're putting in through the machine are. And, in the case of this kind of accretion of rules, it's often that we're just, there's mutually, there's rules that fight against each other. So it's just, I remember I was talking to a senior official in the transportation department in San Francisco. And she was saying, like, we spend 90% of our time on reporting. Like, we spend so much time submitting information that she's like, I'm sure there is no one on the other end of. It's like it's a ghost in the machine. Somebody asked for an oversight report 10 years ago because at the moment it was responsive to some problem. And now we're 10 years later and we're still needing to send these reports that probably don't even get opened. There's so much backlog of sort of process and procedure that politicians haven't been incentivized to revisit, because that's not typically what they sort of ran on or what constituents are giving them, credit for. I think one of the things that we're trying to do is build a donor base that's like, no, we don't want our elected officials to talk all the time about the new program they want to do. We want to we want elected officials, and so we just elected 2 new supervisors in San Francisco, this guy, Danny Sauter, and Bilal Mahmood. Bilal is actually a member of our network, and Bilal really gets abundance and state capacity stuff. And he's like, I want to figure out how to improve the operations and I want to do my part as a supervisor to create the conditions by which the folks who work in these departments and agencies of San Francisco can carry out their mandate more effectively. And so having an elected who has read that material and thinks about those things, having a set of donors and sort of coalition partners who see the value in that work is an important piece to turning the machine of government. Because I think it's often as much the disconnect between the legislative branch and the executive branch as anything going on with the public, to basically have legislators pay more attention to the machine that carries out their instructions versus just focusing on their instructions, if that makes sense.
Totally. So since you brought up an elected official, I'd love for you to answer a question that the elected officials who've written to this podcast after we've done abundance episodes basically ask, which is, and it's I understand it empathetically. And basically what they've said is like, look, these ideas are attractive. They're very interesting. They reflect, once again, problems I see in this world. Once again, these are problems of, it doesn't feel like we have enough stuff, or there's too much scarcity. Stuff sounds superficial, but the better frame is just like the scarcity one, right? Like I'm in South Austin, there aren't enough daycare centers. And no matter how much money my wife and I put on the table, like this is an unsolvable problem. This isn't about like wealth inequality or like privilege. It's just like literally there aren't enough. That's a scarcity problem. Like that's the first thing I would say to one of our neighbors. Like if I was talking to like all of like the fellow, couples that are pregnant in like South Austin, I'd talk about that. Like that's a great like thing. I'd say like, look, if I were like a local official, like that's what I'm really focused on. Like here are these straightforward examples of how like there's scarcity in your life. And like I represent a movement that's like focused on that. But so that's like my personal answer to this question I'm about to ask you. But like, what is in it for the politicians when it comes to adopting the abundance agenda? That's the number one question I get from them. Because they're like, look, when I talk to voters, it's not like I'm going to be able to just say, like, hey, like this is a thing. And they're excited. Like when you're talking to an elected about this or a prospective elective, I doubt you're going to basically say like, look, like this abundance agenda is why you're going to make it through the primary. It's going to cinch you in the general, especially because most of the abundance people are usually operating within like blue states, like right now as it stands, or blue parts of Texas places like Austin or Dallas or Houston. So what's the answer to this question?
Yeah, well, so I'll start by saying I think the sort of core idea, and sometimes I phrase abundance. So I've said building 21st century government. Another thing is sort of less capture, more capacity. So it's like you have these, less capture, less narrow interest capture, less supply side capture, more capacity, meaning more government capacity. And so while I think that those ideas are transpartisan, like I believe there will be abundance factions in both the Democratic and Republican parties. Our work to date has been in blue places. And I think so it is really a factional fight. What we're trying to build is factional infrastructure for abundance aligned politicians to win elections versus, either sort of, left progressive kind of electeds or just electeds who don't have, or just like mainline Dems who don't really have a clear, thesis around how they're going to make improvements in people's lives. They just, sort of, this is to the group's discourse. They're just like saying the right things on the questionnaires of all the different groups and get into office and just are kind of responsive to those needs. And so, for those politicians, the early answer is that we're in the very earliest stages of this movement. So it's like they're early adopter, true believer folks, right? So it's like Bilal and Danny are just like, we need government to work better in San Francisco. We need to build more housing. We need to figure out how to increase the supply of the things people need in the city to lead good lives. And so they are sort of coming looking for a package of ideas that can help them do that. And abundance is that package. And we're able to, in one city, San Francisco, provide actual political infrastructure and support for those candidacies. So like we can spend money on IEs in support of their campaigns. We can have
independent expenditures.
Independent expenditures. So like we can contribute money to their campaigns. We've organized a whole coalition of organizations that can get out and knock doors and phone bank and we Grow SF, which is a sort of organization in the San Francisco coalition, has now the #1 voter guide in the city. So we can actually substantively help elected officials in San Francisco. In other places of the country where we don't yet have a chapter, and I'll go into more detail about what a chapter entails, but in those places, it's like we can provide a set of ideas, but it's really only the most frontier adopters who will want to pick that up and run with it. Like we are not able to offer much else, and that's the work that is needed. So let me sell again for a second. There's a second thing that we're, we have these chapter programs. I do want to talk more about how they work, but we're launching in the next month or two a sort of peer network for local elected officials who identify as abundant or even sort of taken in by the ideas, but not yet active participants with them. And so it's going to be a peer network. So it'll be a bunch of cohorts, and folks will be connected with other early adopter, abundant local electeds. And, there'll be some sort of learning around the ideas, but also just, peer networks, or you get value because you're with other people who are working on similar problems. And you can go to somebody who was able to pass a parking, minimums reform bill, or somebody who was able to, lessen the requirements on new childcare providers, and learn how they did it in their city council or in their county. So I think for now, we can offer the stone soup of peer support, and over time we'll be able to offer PACs and, organize coalitional infrastructure. Like this is the work of building a faction, per Steve Tellis's point about needing to build factional infrastructure. It's like there's work to be done. We need to build that donor base. We need to build that the coalitional support.
And before you get to chapters a little more, I just want to highlight and pick up something you basically said, which is my thesis around this is my abundance pitch to politicians isn't this like, oh yeah, this is going to put you over the hump in the primary right now. It's not going to put you over the top in the general election. But I do think what it is going to do, and this is actually the story of the past 10 years, I think it's going to orient you properly in a political moment that we're experiencing right now. And I think when politicians are not oriented around the right framework for the political environment they're running in, they, especially if they're ambitious, and like, spoiler alert, the people who are emailing into the show are very much people who are clearly like, I see myself as like a senator or a governor or maybe even bigger than that someday. So I think if you're thinking on that trajectory, just that's the opportunity right now. Cause like, think about what just happened over the past month. Like, it's now the Trump era. The Obama era is over. The idea that we were going to have this like, emerging Democratic coalition from the early 2000s, like that's gone. Like the idea that like multiracial democracy equals progressive advancement, that's gone, right? Like the idea that like democratic socialism is the future, that's gone. It's gone because like if you look at the House and Senate, it's not going to happen. I think AOC has a bright future, but like if there was a test case to prove they could expand beyond like blue urban cores, it just hasn't worked out. If anything, the squad's actually decreased in size there. So if it were the year 2015, I would say, look, no one's going to like reward you for this, but you really need to understand backlash politics. You need to understand like the hangover from the 2008 financial crisis. And I know that like Occupy Wall Street didn't seem like it was that important, but actually you really need to understand that, right? If you were someone who was listening, and actually the Realignment came out in 2019, so I can't make this claim, but like if I was doing this show in 2015, 2016, I'd be focusing on the immigration story. I'd be focusing on the Brexit story. And if you'd like focused on that story, I think if you're then going into the Biden administration, you would have made different decisions when it came to immigration and border policy and how you actually frame those issues. So once again, it's not like you would have been rewarded electorally in 2018 if you're like an up and coming state legislator who's running for Congress and you have like the perfect articulation of like realignment politics. That wouldn't have helped you win an election, but it would have oriented you properly in this moment. And once again, like to close this out, this is a political moment where, and we put aside sociocultural issues for a second here, because like I think those need to be adjudicated in a variety of different ways, but I don't think like abundance is like A, the movement to do that, and B, like it's like not the venue or the forum to do that. I think right now, like the clear consensus is every voter and frankly every politician is going to have in the back of their minds for the next decade, wow, we thought voters hated unemployment. Turns out they and voters across the globe hate inflation even more. And that literally led to basically 98% of incumbent parties getting thrown out from office. Guess who has an answer for inflationary politics, or at least the opening mindset of like thinking, because like I won't pretend that anyone in the abundance community just has the perfect 10 talking points to answer it. But I think what we do have is the right, like, you need to think about this. It's frustrating because when I talk to like democratic socialists who are still going on about Medicare for all and like universal free college, I'm like, guys, like, I may disagree with you on like the actual policies there, but like that is just like not the moment. That's not happening right now. It's like as if someone were talking about comprehensive immigration reform as being on the table, like this could be a good idea. It's not happening. I think everything that abundance is focusing on very much can, and due to the local focus that you talk so much about, actually can happen. And that's just where you really need to orient yourself as a politician. And I think as the years go on, natural opportunities will come from that just aren't as simple as you're going to win your primary in 2026.
Yeah, I again was strongly nodding, which is unseen audio lead or on audio, but yeah. So I really agree with that, and I can say that I do sense, like I just got a text from one of the folks in our network, and a lieutenant, somebody who's considering a run for lieutenant governor in California, reached out to him and was like, hey, I want to run as like the abundance candidate, for lieutenant governor, like the build, like I want to be the candidate who's like California needs to build again. And, I think Josh Shapiro has sort of, the I-95-ness that Jen talks about, and also talking about government performance. I think there's a set of, you hear Jared Polis talking about sort of, some abundance themes. Like they're clearly like the folks who are talking about this are talented politicians with a good nose for where things
Where
are
the puck's
headed.
going. Yeah.
Yeah. Now that doesn't make I think a thing I want to stress is that I believe there's going to be a lot of abundance veneering on on otherwise at the core mainline Democrats who don't want to go against their coalition or have any like real
What does
intra-party.
abundance veneering look like? Can you give me an
Uh,
example?
well, yeah. So what I mean is, in the same way greenwashing was like, okay, we've recognized that the time demands that we speak responsively to the idea that global warming is a problem. So we're going to say we're doing everything green, but then the results aren't, like the underlying stuff that was happening behind the scenes was not necessarily green. I think people are going to realize like, oh, it's good to talk about government being, more sort of effectively run. And it's good to talk about building in the physical world, but like, are you going to take on then the building trades unions who perversely are like, want to keep a lot of, checks in place because it gives them leverage in project labor agreements? Or are you going to take on, EJ groups around sort
Environmental
of citizen
justice.
environmental justice groups around sort of, certain regulatory frameworks or legal frameworks that sort of, give them more veto power, in the process of building new transmission lines. Like, if it was just as easy as saying it, we would be doing more of this stuff. I think there's actual complicated power dynamics within the Democratic coalition that need to be taken on. And so I think you'll hear many politicians, I think, in the next couple of years pull on some of these themes. And then it'll be the question of, but who's actually taking the hard votes, who's actually doing the work to make these things real? Or is it just that you're signaling to voters that you care about this stuff without actually doing the work?
And we give the perfect example of this and this is why this should all be read in the context of Ezra Klein's like Everything Bagel liberalism piece that folks should check out. And basically it's just like critiquing this idea that like, if you look at a lot of Democratic policy proposals, they'll say like, hey, like we're doing this thing, but actually it turns out we could also do this thing and that thing and this thing with it. And I think an example that everyone likes to cite, though it was over exaggerated as an actual effect, was like with the CHIPS Act, you had like the requirements for like childcare centers. And it later basically emerged that wasn't it's the perfect headline of like, man, that was so silly. And like, apparently that was less of an actual issue on the ground. The headlines made it sound. But what I'm still interested in though, is like the process. And and this is where the abundance veneering comes in. I think that abundance, if done properly, is going to require trade-offs, and it's not going to be able to be all things to all people. And the abundance veneering that I'm thinking about as you give this articulation is there are going to be people who are basically like, oh yeah, like we could totally have like abundant chip manufacturing in this country, right? So like I'm a foreign policy guy, so I always take abundance in like that direction, right? I could take it, and it sounds weird because like you don't think munitions and like abundance, because like abundance sounds like beauty, and munitions are obviously like effing awful and terrible in this like horrible reality of our world. But like I think the munition, it's really funny, like some of my favorite defense folks will reach out after abundance issues. They're like, hey, like, has someone ever put together like an abundance foreign policy? Because like this question of like, hey, what's this basic thing the US government has to do, which is like produce like artillery shells in case there's a great power conflict. Actually, like we can't do that. And the reason why we can't do that perfectly rhyme with the abundance thesis. So just like the point is though, there's like interest in it, but like with the chips thing, you're just going to see people say, and this actually happened, like, oh yeah, of course we need to build like an American semiconductor industry, but also it's very important that we increase unionization in this country. And also, by the way, like we're in the middle of this reckoning about motherhood and parenthood in the American workplace. And we need to make sure we have childcare centers. And actually, we need to have this conversation about like upskilling workers. And then actually there's this new like CTE, like technical education. So like we need to have a requirement that happens. And this is the everything bagel point. I have no beef with any of the 5 things I just listed individually. But the point is that if you combine them if you try to then say that we could do all of these things with no trade-offs, you actually can't do the thing you're actually providing. And that's actually like a real problem.
Yeah, totally. And I think I've thought about this a little bit in the context of, I mean, in the end, it's kind of leadership. Like, it's sort of saying, yes, we have all of these important priorities, but we also, but we can't do trade-off denial. Like we have to decide what is the most important thing to us in this particular bill that we're trying to write, or this particular, program that we're trying to run. And we need to make sure that we succeed in the headline goal. And if we can get some little secondary wins along the way, that's great, but we can't jeopardize the success of the top line goal with the secondary goals. I think that's, it's hard to do. I mean, all of this stuff is hard to do. I think a thing that by working in local politics, you get grounded in some of the realities of this, which is like, they're hard trade-offs to make. If things were easy, somebody else would have already fixed them. Like these are not, this is not easy work. It's easy conceptually. Like I agree that abundance as a sort of core set of ideas is pretty easy to grok and to explain. I think to make them real is difficult, takes work. Let me go back to cell mode for a sec. Let's talk a little bit more about the chapters. So here's an ugly reality, or just ugly, maybe is not the right word, but an unfortunate reality, which is, if you take real that the project is building a new American state, building a 21st century, government. And if you think about this small example in San Francisco of 850,000 or something, 800,000 residents, and this, 39,000 person organization, like change management of a 39,000 person organization is not volunteer work. Like you can't just get a few of your friends together and you get drinks every Tuesday night and you talk about how you're going to make the world better. And that's not going to lead to the change of that organization. And so we have this strong belief, and, YIMBY has been done, like that movement has been done on a relative shoestring budget. California YIMBY is like by far the most well-resourced YIMBY organization, like single advocacy organization in the country. Its budget is a couple $1 million a year. And with a few $1 million a year, they've like helped rewrite the, land use laws of California. So, and many other YIMBY chapters around the country, either through the Welcoming Neighbors network or through YIMBY Action, like those are often all volunteer networks. I think you can get some good stuff done with volunteer energy, but, at the core, you need people who wake up every day and they're like, my job that I get paid to do is to reform the city of San Francisco's government. And so building a staff chapter is hard because people cost money, And so, in San Francisco, we built this donor table, and these are families who are putting in, 6 figures a year as an annual commitment. And we're sort of like, this is a 10 or 20 year project. And so putting that together in other cities is difficult. It will take time to do. We've done a smaller version in Santa Monica with, folks giving a few $1,000s a year and aggregating those folks up, enough to have sort of a partial staff room. We're experimenting with different models. But it takes it just takes real resources to make this work happen. And I think, again, I think there's a lot of excitement about these ideas. I think I wrote a post, a year ago that was like sort of just as a thought experiment, like what would it look like if Ezra Klein if Ezra Klein listeners became like a union, and if everyone contributed money, who believed in Ezra's ideas, and how would you make that real if everybody who listened to Ezra Klein gave 1% of their income, you would have this giant resource base with which to fund, all of this work. So figuring out ways to finance this work, especially when it's local. So there's sort of not really like a national billionaire who's like, oh, I want to pay for, the city of Nashville to be more effective in its, street design or whatever. So anyways, that's a long-winded way of saying like, I think professionally staffed chapters is a really important concept, and, we need to sort of build the local funding infrastructure in all the places that we want to work to make that a reality.
So let's close here and answer the question that the abundance listeners always ask me, so obviously if they're based in SF or Santa Monica / LA, they should really like reach out to Abundance Network. But broadly speaking, like what are the next steps? I just met with an awesome UT senior, Kashiv, who is just great. He's interested in building like a student network. He's talking to some guys and gals at Stanford. So it's like really cool just to hear like organically that these things are kind of happening. And just, I'll just say like from my perspective as like a YIMBY, not YIMBY, as an abundance sort of poster or promoter, students like definitely reach out to me because they want to get connected with folks. But what would you just say are like next steps, other places beyond just like your organization that folks should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly, right. I listened to your riff with Jake about, I agree with you and Steve. Like, I think we need pluralism in this movement. I think different people want to live their lives in different ways. I think sometimes YIMBYs can come off as too like urbanist only. And I think that there's a place for urbanism, which is in cities. And then there's a place for different types of living in suburbs and in rural areas. So all that caveated, like I think local YIMBY groups are places where real work is happening. I think I can see very clearly the ability to like, I wrote a post a couple of years ago called Broad YIMBYism, which is just taking some of the core, which is really abundance, right? It's like taking some of the core intuitions of YIMBYism but stretching them to apply to different areas. So I think getting involved in a local YIMBY chapter, like those are all over the country. And I think those are good places to meet other abundance probably minded folks. So I think that's one thing. I think, there's a coalition of organizations working on making the abundance movement real. And I think one of those orgs, is planning to set up campus chapters. So I think if you're on a campus and you're interested, you could email Marshall or email me and we'll connect you with the folks who are thinking about the campus chapter program, and get campus chapters going. I think that, like I said, if you're a local elected official, we'll be launching that program and you should definitely get involved there. I think if you're listening to Marshall's podcast, you, like me, are sort of early in this scene, right? Like this is still the very early moments of people actually trying to take action on these ideas. And so, you can literally email me and I will connect you with folks in our ecosystem that could help you take a next step depending on your geography or area of interest. Like there's a ton of work to do. And all the on-ramps have not been built yet. And it's not yet a productized space. You kind of have to grope around to wander around to find the right way to contribute. But like, there are ways for you to contribute if you're motivated enough to like take off your headset at the end of a podcast and go to your computer and type an email, like do that. We will plug you in to somewhere meaningful.
I'm glad you put it that way because when I was speaking of Kashiv yesterday, he was very like, dude, like, thank you so much for giving me some of your time. Like, I know this is such an imposition, like driving out from the suburbs to UT and like, blah, 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 blah. My answer to him, and I think this is the answer that builds off what you just said, is that like, basically like, right now, abundance, YIMBYism's gotten a little too big for this, but like abundance though is kind of like a really like deep cut indie band right now. So it's deep like cut. Shocking. It's like
we're playing at tiny venues. You know what I mean? Like you come, you get to meet the band after the show, like, and you can come on tour and be our merch guy. Like it's a tiny crew of folks who are working on this. So
yeah, so it's very, very, very accessible. Great. Well, Misha, thank you so much for coming on The Realignment.
Thanks, Marshall.